this week's video, I'm reviewing ergonomic circular knitting needles from Prym. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. So before we get started, let's talk about why these are called ergonomic knitting needles. I was confused and a little bit skeptical about this label at first based on my understanding of ergonomics, especially as it applied to knitting. I have a feeling other people may also make the same incorrect assumptions I made, so I want to define terms a bit. The definition of ergonomics is this: as relating to or designed for efficiency and comfort in the working environment. And also this: ergonomics is concerned with the fit between the user, equipment, and their environments. It takes account of the user's capabilities and limitations in seeking to ensure that tasks, functions, information, and the environment suit each user. The first time I heard the word ergonomic was back in the 90s when I was working in technology. Many office workers were experiencing repetitive stress injuries and carpal tunnel as they spent more and more of their days working at a keyboard. So ergonomic keyboards, those keyboards that were split apart and angled, provided a more comfortable position for keyboarding and did a lot to reduce those repetitive stress injuries. These days, I spend my time amongst knitters, and when we discuss ergonomics, we are usually talking about our body position, hand position, and knitting style, and how those things combine to cause or prevent repetitive stress injuries. So in my mind, ergonomic knitting needles was a label for needles that would resolve the repetitive stress issues that knitters have, but that's not what it means, and that's not what these needles do. An ergonomic tool could have the result of reducing injuries like the ergonomic keyboard, but in this case, the ergonomics involves design changes that address issues with the tool, the knitting needle, that cause problems as individual stitches are created, as they are moved along the needles, and as the needles are stored away with live stitches sitting on them. The goal is to increase efficiency and comfort in the knitting environment, but as it pertains to those stitches on the needle, not as it pertains to eliminating repetitive stress injuries. So now that we have that cleared up, on to the review. The needles I have here are 4.5 millimeter, which is a US size 7, and it's 32 inches in length, which is 80 centimeters. The needle tips are made of a synthetic material, which is another word for plastic. They're not stiff. They do have some flex in them, but they're not floppy. So if you're used to a very stiff needle, it's not going to really feel that different. It's not going to feel like it's too floppy at all. They're warm in the hand. The taper is long and narrow, and it ends in this teardrop shaped hook, they call it. And it's the weirdest thing about the needles, and it's the feature that I was the most worried about. I really thought I might hate these needles, and the main reason would be this tip, but it turns out to be the feature that I love the most. This tip might be one place that can eliminate pain that you may experience while knitting. So if you are the type of knitter who, when you complete a stitch, you push the needle tip in order to complete the stitch, this will dull that pain a bit. Now, another thing is this is a very long taper. Some people work very close to the tips and they may find that this is an unusually long taper. It's the same length that I'm used to using, and my style of knitting is to always make sure that the stitch is completely on the shaft before I push stitches off. So for my style of knitting, this fits perfectly. For some people, they may have to get used to completing the stitch further away from the tip than they're used to. I really liked the way that these needles knit stitches. I think they'd be really great with splitty yarn. I haven't tried them on a splitty yarn, but I haven't split any stitches with these needles either. So that was something that I found really nice about them. One thing that I was worried about this tip was how well they would work multiple stitch decreases, and it's not a problem either. Just the length of the tip and how narrow it gets right here before that bulb really helps to make them useful in all sorts of situations. Now here I've got a little cable. I was worried about using these needle tips when cabling without a cable needle. But again, I had no problem with that. This is too early to cable for this cable, but I'm going to do it anyway. So to cable without a cable needle, I would normally reorder the stitches. I'd come across these two. So the tip has to be long enough to be able to do that, hold those stitches on there while I reorder the stitches. So they work really well for that. Nothing gets split. I was really impressed by that. In fact, in the course of knitting this little swatch, I've taken the stitches off the needles probably 3 or 4 times, and every time I've gone back to recapture the stitches, I haven't split a single stitch. That's really unusual for me. When recapturing stitches with my pointy needles, I tend to split most stitches rather than only a few or none. So that is a really useful feature in these needles. So the bulk of the shaft is triangular in shape. So this part is round up until here, and then it becomes triangular in shape. The claim is that this reduces the points of contact, allowing the stitches to slide smoothly along the needle. I don't know how much drag the needles would have if the shaft was round all the way. I mean, they slide along just fine, but they do have more drag than metal, even with this triangular shape. So for a slippery yarn, these would be really good, just like bamboo would be good for a slippery yarn. So maybe the triangular shape reduces the drag the needle would have otherwise, but I would say they are similar to bamboo needles and nowhere near as slippery as metal needles. Whether you would find that to be an advantage or a disadvantage will be based on your personal preference. For me, this amount of drag is most useful when the yarn is quite slippery. Now, because I'm used to using metal needles and these have a bit more drag, I tend to unconsciously loosen my knitting. So I'm getting 1 stitch less per 4 inches than I would get with metal needles. And that's something to be aware of if you're not used to the fact that your gauge can change when the material changes. Now, this cable is extremely flexible. You can see this cable. It's kind of a twisted wire. It's coated in plastic, but inside the plastic you can see there's twisted wire, and it's pretty thin. These cables are pretty thin compared to the cables that you might see on other circular needles. They're very flexible. They have no memory, which means they don't stay stuck in the twisted shape that a lot of needles with plastic cables have a problem with. Because these cables are so thin, there is kind of a gradual taper on this join between the cable and the shaft. But it is a bit of a difference. And at first, one of these joins, not the other one, but one of them tended to catch the last stitch. And I think it's because my tendency is normally just to do this when I'm getting the stitches back on the needle for magic loop. And the last stitch would get caught sometimes here. So it's a little bit dragging, like right here, you can see how it's getting caught. So what I ended up doing just unconsciously was I started to line this thing up when I was pushing them on the needle, and then it wouldn't create a problem. I don't know how I would feel about this if this entire needle were loaded up with stitches and it was constantly moving them up over that join. That I'm not sure how I would feel about. Prym website says they come in 2 lengths, 60 centimeters, which is 24 inches, and 80 centimeters, which is 32 inches. The 60 centimeter needles come in, start at 4.5 millimeter, which is a US 7, and they go up to 7 millimeters, which is a US 10 3/4. And the 32-inch needles, the 80 centimeters, start again at 4.5 millimeters and go up to 12 millimeters. The circular needles do not go as small in needle size as the double points or the straight needles. I didn't buy or try the straight needles or double pointed needles, but I do have some information about them. The straight needles come in two lengths, 35 centimeters, which is 14 inches, and they come in sizes from 3 millimeters to 10 millimeters, which is a US 2.5 to a US 15. They also come in a 40 centimeter or 16-inch length in sizes from 3 millimeters to 10 millimeters, which are US 2.5 to a US 17. Now these are long needles and are ideal for people who anchor the right-hand needle in some way, pit knitters, arm knitters, or my old style, which was to anchor at the junction of my hip and thigh. An additional ergonomic innovation in the straights is that the knob at the end of the needle will clip to the shaft near the tip of the other needle so that the stitches on the needles are prevented from sliding off when you stuff your project in your project bag. The DPNs, both ends of the DPNs are the same with the round shaft and taper ending in a teardrop point. They are 20 centimeters or 8 inches long, come in sets of 5 from a 3 millimeter to an 8 millimeter in tip diameter. The price of the needles varies by type and size. Single points start at just under $8, DPNs start at just under $10, and circs start at just under $11. And prices increase as the diameter of the tip increases. I believe the high end is around $13 or $14. These needles are available all over Europe, but there are currently no US retailers, but you can order them from Amazon.com like I did, and they will be shipped from a UK retailer. I have heard that retailers in the US will be getting them soon, but I don't know when that will be. So you might want to ask your local yarn shop if they plan on getting them in. I found the Prym needles worth trying out, and I will add them to my collection of needles because I can see particular situations in which I would find them really worth using, but they aren't going to replace my existing favorites. I still prefer slippery metal needles, but I do wish they had that little teardrop hook at the end. There are always many ways of getting to the same endpoint in knitting, whether you use different tools or different techniques. And I find it good to know as many of those different ways as possible, because even if a tool or technique ends up being my least favorite most of the time, it often turns out to be the best tool or technique in a specific situation. If you aren't already a subscriber, I'd love it if you would subscribe. You can click on my face over here, and over here you can see one of my previous videos that YouTube thinks you might enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.